who were testing positive. And so as early as October of 1984, the blood bankers knew, based on tests they were doing in their own blood banks, that there were infected people walking in the door. And they did not change what they were doing until that test was licensed on March the 15th, 1985.
The test we are licensing today is the answer to the prayers of thousands of Americans facing surgery or otherwise requiring blood. It is designed to screen blood.
What should have been a moment of triumph for science had already turned sour. The investigation of Bob Gallo caused increasing tension in the AIDS research community. The questions continued unabated about certain practices in Gallo's lab. The French became increasingly bitter at what they saw as inadequate recognition of their achievements.
I think the history is clear-cut. The first isolation of a virus later shown to be the AIDS virus was at the Pasteur Institute. The compelling evidence that convinced the scientific community that this kind of virus is the cause of AIDS came from us. The proper growth of the virus came from this laboratory, principally through Nika Popovic. The development of a sensitive, workable blood test, I don't think we have to debate. I think the history speaks for itself of where blood tests were done and lives were saved.
It was too late, though, to save Frances Borchardt. In June 1985, her condition deteriorated. Her family was quickly called to the hospital.
And I kept telling her to let go. There was no way that I could have let it go on any longer. I kept saying, Mom, it's okay, go. And she was stubborn till the last. They all left the hospital, and as soon as they left, she died.
It was the very day the blood test was finally put on the market.
In the early days, I'd sit and I'd look at a chair and I just wish that I could see her. I don't wish that anymore. But there's a constant hole, and there's nothing else that can fill it. She made an impact on all of our lives. If there were ever two people who were really in love with each other, it was my mother and father.
I lost my right hand, my left hand. In fact, I lost my reason for living in a certain way.
It is now known that by 1985, 6,054 people became infected with the AIDS virus because of transfusions, and almost 3,000 hemophiliacs contracted AIDS. In Africa, by the time the blood test came on the market, only a few cases of AIDS had been confirmed. Surgeon Anne Bailey was one of the first to investigate. She heard reports from Uganda of a fatal new disease which the locals called SLIM. Dr. Bailey arrived at Masaka Hospital with some colleagues from Kampala. Masaka was the main town in the Lake Victoria region where the unexplained deaths had been reported 2 years before.
We went into the hospital, and Masaka Hospital was pretty grim. It was depressed.
While her colleagues examined some patients, Anne Bailey's eye was drawn to other people in the ward. She was shocked by the patient's condition.
Eventually people get too weak to sit up, too weak to walk. Their memories fail. Their speech and actions become very slow. Their facial expression is lost. It becomes a blank.
To the surprise of Dr. Roy Magurwa, Anne Bailey kept bringing extra patients and even their visitors to be tested.
We had mixed feelings. I remember talking to some of my colleagues when we looked at Anne Bailey's sort of going into the trouble of taking history and examining some of the patients who we didn't think had anything wrong with them, and we were wondering why. We documented the history, the physical findings, and we took blood, and this blood was sent to UK. The test for HIV at that time had just been discovered. The virus was being referred to as HTLV3, not HIV as we know it now.
Anne Bailey Bailey sent 110 blood samples to London. They were analyzed by Dr. Robin Weiss, a leading British scientist who, ironically, had been showing the French how to mass-produce the virus for their own blood test. Anne Bailey's instincts had been right. Not only the hospital cases, but all the other people she brought in for testing were infected with the AIDS virus. There was no reason to link any of the cases with homosexuality.
We were able to show that skin disease was nothing other than AIDS, and that those people and many of their still healthy relatives in that area were infected with HIV. It was our first real insight into the high prevalence of HIV in Africa, transmitted heterosexually.
Dr. David Sirwada had also been on the trip to Masaka Hospital.
This was an eye-opener because we thought this was not our problem, it was out in white homosexuals. And the lesson here was, it was here, and from what we could gather, it was a big epidemic already. I was very frustrated, and the health officials were very reluctant to accept this. The political situation didn't help either. It took like 5 years, really, everybody to realize that the disease is here, and I believe, I have no doubt in my mind, during that time, the epidemic really grew out of hand.
I felt completely overwhelmed by it. I couldn't get those young people out of my mind. I couldn't get out of my mind the significance of about a quarter of all the people we'd seen being HIV infected. They reminded me of the photographs of victims from the Holocaust concentration camps at the end of the 39-45 war. They were mostly in their middle 20s. They were apathetic with a haunted, glazed expression on their faces, and they were quite helpless. It's a very lonely way to die, and some of them go on so long.
The tragedy of AIDS in Africa was just unfolding.
I was appalled by the squalor of dying in that way, the squalor of their helplessness, the poverty of the circumstances I'd seen, and I wanted some way of dignifying their deaths. I longed for music, poetry, something which would restore to them some of their human dignity.
Hopelessness and despair filled the hearts of patients and doctors alike. And yet it would be another long year before any government anywhere in the world took decisive action.
The indifference that world governments displayed toward the AIDS epidemic during the mid-1980s is puzzling even now. Perhaps it was because AIDS patients were already on the outside of mainstream society. Or perhaps we were lulled into complacency by a misplaced faith in modern medicine. After all, we had in this century used vaccines to virtually eliminate smallpox and polio, both of them deadly diseases caused by a virus. Now that the AIDS virus had been identified, perhaps a vaccine could be developed quickly. We were wrong. Conventional techniques didn't work because AIDS is an unusual virus. Its ability to camouflage and transform itself in the body's cells makes it an elusive target. So, in the middle of the decade, even though there were hints of promise, there was little comfort for thousands of infected Americans. Next week, A Time of AIDS focuses on the frustration over the lack of medical progress and the apparent lack of official interest that finally mobilized angry AIDS activists with remarkable consequences. For Discovery Journal, I'm John Paul.
Ok, entonces miren, nos quedan unos minutos. Lo que yo quisiera es cada quien aprovechar a todos los que tomaron notas, que ahorita se acuerdan de algo para tratar de cerrarlo, verlo con alguno de los autores. Yo ya no empezaría ahorita un tema, me falta un solo tema antes del examen, que es el tema de cierre precisamente